He thought he could control everything, his empire, his life, his emotions. But when everything he built starts slipping through his fingers, he has to face the one thing he's never been able to control, himself. The sun was setting over the hills as Ember Hayes drove up the long, winding road toward the luxury villa perched high above the city. The villa was Brock Caldwell's private retreat, a testament to his wealth, power, and emotional distance. The estate seemed to grow out of the mountain itself, all glass and marble, sharp angles, and breathtaking views of the valley below. It was a place where success and control were etched into every corner, but Ember couldn't shake the feeling that it was also a place where something was missing. Ember, a talented architect with a reputation for transforming spaces, had been hired to consult on Brock's latest project, a luxury hotel he intended to open on the property. Her task was clear: design something that reflected the elegance and exclusivity of the villa, but also made people feel welcomed, not overpowered by the grandeur. She had prepared for the meeting for weeks, but now that she was standing in the shadow of the mansion, she couldn't help but feel small. Brock greeted her at the door, his tall, broad frame casting a long shadow in the golden light. He was everything she had expected: a billionaire businessman with sharp eyes, a perfectly tailored suit, and an air of command that never seemed to waver. His gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, and Ember felt a flicker of attraction, but she quickly pushed it aside. She wasn't here to flirt, she was here to work. "Glad you could make it, Ember," he said, his voice low and even. "Let's get to work." She nodded, following him through the grand hallways. The marble floors were flawless, the art on the walls expensive and modern. Everything was perfect, but something about the place felt cold. It wasn't just the design, it was something in the air, something unspoken between them. As they walked, Brock outlined his vision for the hotel. He was meticulous, detailing every expectation, every requirement. His words were measured, his tone authoritative. Ember could tell he had no patience for anything less than perfection. She listened carefully, offering suggestions where she could. But all the while, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was out of her depth. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they took a break on the terrace. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills stretching into the distance, the lights of the city twinkling far below. It was an awe-inspiring sight, but as Ember stood there, looking out at the world, she couldn't help but feel small against the grandeur of it all. Brock stepped beside her, his presence just as overwhelming as the view. "You must be used to this kind of luxury by now," he said, his voice softening for the first time that evening. "I've worked on some beautiful projects," Ember replied, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "But this is something else entirely. It's overwhelming." Brock smiled, a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Power, control, wealth, they can be overwhelming. But they're also necessary if you want to keep moving forward. Ember turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his words. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Do you ever let go of control?" she asked before she could stop herself. Brock's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had been caught off guard. "Control is necessary. Without it, things fall apart." Ember nodded, but in that moment, she saw something else in Brock. His wealth, his empire, it wasn't just a symbol of success, it was a shield, and she wondered if that shield had kept him from ever truly feeling anything. The following days blurred together as Ember worked with Brock on the project. Despite the professional nature of their interactions, there was an undeniable chemistry between them. She found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain, but she remained focused, always keeping a careful distance. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, Ember stayed behind to go over some designs in one of the villa's guest rooms. As she examined the blueprints, she noticed something odd, a faint outline beneath a thick layer of dust on a desk drawer. Curiosity piqued. She opened the drawer to find a faded envelope, yellowed with age. She hesitated, but something urged her to open it. Inside was a letter, written in a delicate, flowing hand. The message was cryptic, but it was unmistakable. "The truth lies beyond the luxury. Let go, or it will consume you." The letter was signed with an initial she didn't recognize, S. Ember's heart raced. What was this about? She glanced around the room, feeling the weight of the villa's silence press in on her. The words seemed out of place, like a secret, like something that wasn't meant to be uncovered. But Ember couldn't ignore it. She tucked the letter into her bag, determined to find out more. The next morning, she approached Brock with the letter. "I found this last night," she said, handing it to him. Brock's face paled as he read the words. He looked up at Ember, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know you were going through my things," he said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "I wasn't trying to invade your privacy," she replied, feeling the tension rise between them. "But I think it's important. The letter, what does it mean?" Brock looked at her for a long moment before sighing. "It's from my late wife," he admitted. "She wrote that before she died. I didn't want anyone to read it. Not even me." Ember's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because it's a reminder of everything I've lost," Brock said, his voice tight with emotion. "I thought I could control everything, that I could shield myself from pain by keeping everything perfect. But I was wrong." For the first time, Ember saw the man behind the billionaire facade, vulnerable, conflicted, and human. The following day, the professional tension between Ember and Brock lingered, though they worked side by side on the design project with remarkable efficiency. Brock had barely acknowledged the letter from his late wife since their brief conversation about it. The subject had been dropped quickly, and Ember wasn't sure if he was avoiding it or if he was simply too absorbed in his world of deadlines and demands. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Brock than the cold, calculated persona he projected. There were moments, fleeting but telling, when he would lower his guard, when his eyes would soften or his voice would crack. But just as quickly, he'd retreat behind the fortress he'd built around himself. They spent most of the day walking through the villa, discussing floor plans and how the space could be both luxurious and functional. Brock was meticulous, almost to the point of obsession. Everything had to be perfect. As they sat in the formal dining room, reviewing mock-up designs, Ember watched him, wondering how someone could be so consumed by the need for control. "Perfectly symmetrical," he said, his finger tracing the edges of the drawing. "It must be. Balance is everything." Ember blinked, trying to keep her frustration in check. "Balance doesn't always mean perfection," she said quietly, keeping her voice even. Brock paused, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he met her gaze. "You think imperfections add value?" She hesitated, wondering if she was pushing too hard. "No. I think balance can be found in the space between perfection and reality," she replied, meeting his gaze without backing down. Brock's lips twitched into a smile, the first real smile he'd offered her since their initial meeting. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She wasn't sure if he respected her stubbornness or if he was just amused by it, but something between them had shifted. The tension wasn't gone, but it felt different now, less confrontational, more equal. They took a break later, stepping out onto the terrace to stretch their legs. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the hills, and Ember found herself drawn to the view. She felt small standing at the edge, surrounded by Brock's opulence, but there was something oddly comforting about the quiet moment. "You really don't understand it, do you?" Brock's voice broke the silence, and she turned to find him standing beside her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Understand what?" she asked, sensing a deeper question buried beneath his words. "Control," he said, his voice quiet. "It's not about the wealth or the villa. It's about keeping everything, everyone, exactly where I need them to be, to ensure nothing goes wrong." Ember studied him, her mind racing as she tried to understand the complexity of the man in front of her. "Is it worth it?" she asked before she could stop herself. "All that control. Doesn't it make you feel alone?" Brock's gaze softened, and for a moment she could see a flicker of vulnerability, something raw that he quickly buried behind a mask of indifference. He didn't answer right away, as if weighing her words. "It's all I know," he said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe it's the only thing that's kept me from falling apart." Ember's heart softened at his admission, but she couldn't let her guard down completely. She had her own walls to protect. "Control doesn't keep you from falling apart," she replied gently. "It just hides the cracks." Brock didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on her for a long moment, searching, almost like he was seeing her for the first time. The silence stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, almost awkward rhythm as they returned to their work in the guest room. Despite the growing chemistry between them, Ember knew that it couldn't just be about the project anymore. There was something deeper at play, something both of them were skirting around, afraid to face head-on. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ember stayed behind in the villa to review some of the final touches she had made to the design plans. She sat at the desk where she had discovered the letter earlier. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The more she turned the words over in her mind, the more she realized that letting go of control was a central theme in both their lives. Brock had built his empire on control, his wealth, his power, his empire, but at what cost? And what about her? Had she allowed herself to be as controlled by her past as Brock had been by his? Ember didn't want to admit it, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized she had a lot in common with Brock. She had never let anyone in, never let anyone get close enough to challenge her sense of self. She had used her work as a shield, just as he used his empire. The difference was, she hadn't lost someone as important as Brock had. She hadn't faced the kind of grief that could shatter your entire world. She ran her fingers over the edge of the letter again, her thoughts swirling. Let go, or it will consume you. Maybe it was time for both of them to let go. The days following their emotional conversation on the terrace passed quickly. Ember couldn't shake the weight of what Brock had shared with her, nor the unsettling feeling that she was becoming entangled in something bigger than the design project she had come to tackle. At first, things continued as they had before. They worked long hours, walking through the villa and discussing the finer details of the hotel's design. But now, Ember felt Brock's eyes on her more often, calculating, contemplative, almost as if he were waiting for something. She noticed that he spoke less, but when he did, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Brock wasn't just the billionaire businessman anymore. He was human. But the more Ember saw this, the more she questioned her own feelings. She hadn't signed up for this. She was here to work, to focus on the job. And yet, there was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in, despite her best efforts to keep her distance. One evening, after a particularly long day, Brock asked Ember to stay behind and review the final designs for the project. She reluctantly agreed, sitting down at the desk with her sketchbook in hand. Brock stood nearby, watching her work in silence. His gaze never left her, making it hard for her to focus. "Is something wrong?" Ember asked, glancing up from the designs. Brock's expression shifted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. He was still as enigmatic as ever, his emotions tightly held within him. "I've been thinking," he finally said, his voice low. "About control." Ember raised an eyebrow, sensing that he was about to say something that would change the dynamic between them again. "Control is a double-edged sword," he continued. "You can keep everything in line, but eventually it wears you down. I've kept so much in control, so tight, for so long, I didn't realize how much of me I'd lost in the process." Ember's heart skipped a beat. She'd heard the words before, but now they had weight. They weren't just theoretical anymore. They were part of the man standing in front of her. She couldn't help but wonder if he had been the one to lose himself in all the perfection he'd created. "What made you realize this now?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He turned to face her fully, his expression more open than it had been all week. "Losing something important made me see it. I pushed people away. I pushed myself away. And now I'm stuck in this shell." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Ember studied him, not just the businessman or the billionaire, but the person who had been carrying an invisible burden for so long. She knew there was still so much he wasn't saying, but this admission felt like a breakthrough, a crack in the foundation that had held him together for so long. "I've been there," Ember said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "I've hidden behind work before, thinking if I could just control everything, it would keep me safe. But it doesn't work that way. Eventually, you have to let go." Brock's eyes softened for a moment, and he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Letting go is hard," especially when it feels like it will destroy everything. Ember's heart raced, and for a split second she thought he might reach for her, might try to bridge the distance between them with more than words. But then, just as quickly, the walls came back up. The vulnerability vanished, and Brock turned his attention back to the sketches on the desk, the distance between them suddenly feeling much larger than it had moments before. "Let's finish the designs," he said, his voice colder now, more businesslike. Ember nodded, her chest tight with the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to help him, but she knew he had to make the decision to change on his own. She couldn't force him to let go, but she could see now that Brock was at a crossroads. The choice to change was his, but the path was clearer than it had been before. The next few days were filled with work and little else. The project was nearing completion, and Ember felt the weight of Brock's emotional turmoil pressing on her. She found herself thinking about him constantly, about the way he had opened up to her in those rare moments of vulnerability, and the way he shut down just as quickly. But the cracks in his control were starting to show. There were small things, tiny moments that Ember noticed, that spoke volumes. He was more distracted, his sharp, commanding presence replaced by an air of uncertainty. At times, he seemed distant, as though his mind were elsewhere. Other times, he seemed on edge, the smallest slip-up or mistake setting him off. One afternoon, as they reviewed the final plans together, Brock's frustration bubbled to the surface. He flipped through the pages of the design mock-ups, his hand gripping the edges tightly as if they were the only thing anchoring him to reality. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "It's not perfect enough. This isn't what I wanted." Ember didn't flinch at the outburst. She had seen it coming. His need for control had always been tied to perfectionism, but she had hoped he would have let go of that by now. "Brock, it's as close as we're going to get," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Perfection is an illusion. You can't expect every detail to fall into place exactly the way you envision." Brock didn't respond at first. He just stared at the plans in front of him, his jaw clenched in frustration. It was clear that the perfection he sought wasn't just about the designs. It was about his life, his relationships, and the emotional walls he had built to protect himself. "I know it's not perfect," he said quietly, the frustration giving way to something else. "But it's the only thing I can control. If I can't control that, then what do I have left?" Ember's heart tightened. She could see how desperate he was to keep his world in order, to keep himself from falling apart. But she also knew that the more he clung to control, the more isolated he would become. The lesson she had learned was clear: control doesn't protect you. It keeps you from living. "Maybe it's time to stop trying to control everything," Ember said, her voice softer now, more understanding. "Maybe it's time to start trusting yourself and those around you." There was a long pause, and Brock's gaze flickered to her, almost as if he was seeing her for the first time. His eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the walls between them seemed to lower. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ember stepped closer, her heart aching for him. "You don't have to know right now, but you can start. Just trust me, trust someone." It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. And that, Ember knew, was the only way Brock could begin to heal, by letting go of the control that had defined him for so long. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would become a turning point for them both. It wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about trust, about learning to let go of the past, of the pain, and most importantly, of the need to be in control all the time. Later that night, as Ember reviewed the designs in her room, her thoughts continued to swirl around Brock. She had seen the cracks in his exterior, but it was clear that he wasn't ready to let go completely. Not yet. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect herself from the emotional upheaval that was bound to come. But another part, the part she didn't want to acknowledge, was drawn to him. She had been close to her own emotional breakdowns before, and she could see the same patterns in him. Ember knew better than to get emotionally involved with someone like Brock, someone who had so much power but so little control over his own heart. Yet, she couldn't deny that the moments of vulnerability he shared with her had made her see a side of him she wasn't prepared for. Brock wasn't just a billionaire with a powerful empire. He was a man who had lost everything that mattered and didn't know how to rebuild. The next morning, Ember couldn't shake the feeling of the letter from Brock's late wife. The words haunted her as she moved through her workday, the cryptic message still fresh in her mind. The truth lies beyond the luxury. Let go, or it will consume you. She had spent the evening turning those words over and over in her mind, as though the letter held some sort of key that Brock needed to unlock. But the key wasn't for a door. It was for his heart, for the place where his grief had festered in silence. He had built a life of perfection, hiding behind wealth and control, but all that was only a mask. Ember now realized that his need for control wasn't just about his business. It was about protecting himself from facing the pain of loss. Brock had never been willing to confront his emotions, but it was clear that something was slowly breaking through his defenses. Ember didn't know what he needed, but she knew that this emotional barricade he had built wasn't sustainable. Later that day, Brock seemed more withdrawn than usual. He was quieter, his attention split between the designs and the phone calls he couldn't seem to avoid. Ember noticed the lines of stress that had etched themselves deeper into his face over the past few days. His usual confident air was gone, replaced with a kind of muted frustration. When he finally left the room to take another phone call, Ember found herself alone in the study again, standing beside the desk where the letter had been tucked away. She had made a promise to herself not to let curiosity get the best of her, but after everything that had happened between them, she felt compelled to look deeper. She knew this wasn't just about the project. Brock's life, his emotional journey, was intertwined with the design they were creating. Her fingers brushed over the surface of the desk where she'd found the letter before. She hesitated, then pulled open the drawer once more. What was Brock hiding? What had his wife tried to tell him before she passed? The letter seemed like a fragile thread of connection to a side of Brock he had worked so hard to conceal. Ember couldn't ignore it anymore. This time, the drawer opened without resistance, and the letter lay there, waiting for her. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the paper again. It felt like an intrusion, but she needed to understand. The words were just as haunting this time as they had been before. The walls you've built will only hold you in. Let go of the control. The man you were before is still here, but you can't live in his shadow forever. You must decide. The luxury you've created will suffocate you if you don't change. The message was clearer this time. It wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. Brock's late wife had known what he refused to acknowledge. She had seen what his empire had done to him, how it had isolated him, how it had turned him into someone who couldn't experience life, not truly. Ember folded the letter carefully and tucked it back in the drawer, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery. She could see now that Brock's emotional isolation wasn't just something he had done to himself. It was a consequence of the very life he had built. But what could she do with this knowledge? Was it her place to confront him with it again? To push him further toward the emotional reckoning he so desperately needed? Ember didn't have the answers, but she couldn't walk away from this. She knew she was becoming too involved, professionally and emotionally, but something in her couldn't ignore the quiet desperation she saw in him. She had to help him face his grief. She had to help him understand that his need for control was what had kept him from truly living. Later that evening, as the villa darkened with the fall of night, Ember was alone in her room. She sat at the desk, staring out the window at the sprawling view of the city below. The lights of the town twinkled in the distance, but the view felt like a distant echo to her now. The villa, once so grand and imposing, now seemed more like a cage, a gilded cage, where both Brock and Ember had become trapped by their own fears. She thought about the letter, about his wife, and about Brock. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way for him to heal, not by forcing perfection, but by accepting vulnerability, by letting go. But Brock wasn't ready for that, and as much as Ember wanted to help, she couldn't force him to take that step. The next morning, the villa was still as silent as the night before. The air outside was crisp, the sunlight dappling through the windows, but inside, the tension lingered. Ember had spent the early hours reviewing her designs for the final time, making sure everything was perfect. But perfection had become a hollow pursuit. As much as she tried to immerse herself in the project, her mind kept drifting back to the letter she had discovered, the cryptic message from Brock's late wife. The words had been unsettling, a call for Brock to confront the walls he'd built around himself. For someone who seemed to control everything in his life, the idea of surrendering control must have felt like a death sentence. And yet, Ember understood that it was the very thing he needed to learn if he was ever going to find peace. The designs in front of her felt like a metaphor for what was happening with Brock. The villa's sleek, perfect lines and polished surfaces were beautiful, impressive even, but they couldn't hide the emptiness beneath. Ember had worked in countless spaces, but she knew that the most meaningful designs were always the ones that reflected life, imperfect, messy, and full of depth. What Brock had created was a reflection of his desire for control, but it was missing something vital. It lacked heart. As she folded the designs and put them aside, Brock entered the room. His usual confidence was still there, but something had shifted in him. His eyes were a little more guarded, and his posture, though still commanding, was less rigid. There was a sense of vulnerability in the way he looked at her, as if he were unsure of how to act around her now. Ember wondered if it was because of the letter. Did he realize how much it revealed about him? "I've been thinking about your suggestion," Brock said, his voice softer than usual. "About letting go." Ember looked up from the desk, surprised by the sudden change in tone. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the one where Brock could either accept the challenge or retreat back into his armor. She didn't know what he would choose, but she knew that this was the turning point. "You don't have to do it all at once," she said, her voice gentle. "It's not about giving up everything at once. It's about making small changes, learning to trust yourself and others." Brock stood across the room from her, his gaze steady but conflicted. Trust. He said the word like it was foreign, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I've built everything on trust before. People let me down." Ember nodded, understanding the pain in his words. She could see that his need for control wasn't born from arrogance. It was born from hurt. Brock's trust had been shattered, and instead of facing that pain, he had built walls around it, walls that kept him from ever truly feeling again. The walls had allowed him to maintain control, but at the cost of connection, the cost of love. "I understand," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to be afraid to trust. But living in fear of being hurt again doesn't help you heal. You have to start somewhere." Brock's eyes softened for a moment, and he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to start. I've been holding on to everything for so long. If I let go, what happens then?" Ember felt a lump form in her throat. She knew he wasn't just talking about the project or the villa. He was talking about his life, his identity. Control had been his anchor, but it had also kept him afloat in an ocean of grief and fear. Letting go would mean confronting all of it, the pain, the loss, the loneliness. But it would also mean that he could live again. "You don't have to know all the answers," Ember said softly, crossing the room to where he stood. "The important thing is that you start asking the questions. Trust doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're strong enough to be vulnerable. You've been hiding behind your empire for so long, Brock. But you don't have to keep living like that." He met her gaze, a long moment of silence passing between them. Brock was at a crossroads, and Ember could feel it in the air. His walls had started to crack, but it was up to him whether he would continue to hold on to them or begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding himself. "I'm not sure I can do it," Brock said finally, his voice filled with uncertainty. "You don't have to do it all at once," Ember repeated, "but you have to want to. Wanting to change is the first step, and I believe you can." Brock looked down at the floor, his mind racing as he processed her words. Ember stood beside him, giving him space, but also offering him the support he hadn't known he needed. She wasn't trying to force him to change, she was just giving him the room to make the decision on his own. A few moments passed before Brock spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been afraid that if I let go, I'll lose everything." Ember took a step closer, her hand gently brushing against his. "But you've already lost so much, haven't you?" She didn't need to say more. The pain in his eyes was all the answer she needed. Letting go doesn't mean losing everything, Brock. It means making room for something new. for love, for trust. Brock raised his eyes to hers, and in that moment, Ember saw the shift in him. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of something that told her he was willing to try. For the first time, she saw Brock let down his guard, if only a little. It was the beginning, and she wasn't sure where it would lead, but it was a start. "I'll try," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll try to trust again." Ember smiled softly, her heart swelling with hope. That's all anyone can do. Brock's journey is just beginning. Learning to trust and let go is never easy. Have you ever had to confront your own need for control? How did you overcome it, or are you still holding on? It wasn't long before the facade Brock had carefully built for years began to crack. The days following their conversation about control and trust had been quiet. Too quiet, Ember thought. Brock had been more reflective than usual, keeping to himself during meetings and rarely making eye contact. Though she'd seen a glimpse of change in him, the shift wasn't instantaneous, and the walls he'd erected for so long weren't going to crumble overnight. But then came the call that shattered everything. The hotel project Brock had been pouring his heart into for the last year had hit a major roadblock. The financial backer he had counted on for the final stages of development had pulled out, citing concerns about market conditions. As the news spread, the weight of the situation was clear. The project, the one thing he had devoted himself to above all else, was at risk of falling apart. Ember had been reviewing final plans when Brock's assistant, Lena, stepped into the room, her face pale. She looked at Ember before speaking, her voice low. "Brock needs you," Lena said simply, before leaving just as quickly. Ember's heart sank. She had seen Brock work through challenges before, but this felt different. There was a raw edge to the tension that made everything feel more real. This wasn't just about design or profit. It was about his identity. She found Brock in his office, standing by the window, his back to her. The same window where they'd shared their first honest conversation. The view hadn't changed. The city lights still twinkled beneath them, but the air in the room felt charged, heavy with the weight of his struggle. "Brock." Ember's voice broke through the silence. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tighter than usual, his eyes clouded with frustration and panic. "Lena told you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ember nodded, stepping closer. She could see it now. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with the raw panic of someone whose world was slipping out of their control. The man who had always held the reins of every situation seemed lost, small, fragile. "This isn't just about the project," Brock said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It's everything. I've built my life on this. If this falls apart, everything will. I can't afford to fail." Ember took a step closer, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily in the room. She knew this moment had been coming. The question wasn't about whether Brock would face a crisis, it was when. And now that he was here, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been before, she saw the opportunity for him to change. "Brock," Ember said gently, her voice steady, "you've built so much, but you're not just the project you work on. This doesn't define you. You have so much more to offer than your success. You can rebuild. You just need to trust that there's more to life than perfection." He scoffed, turning back to the window, his fingers gripping the edge of the glass. "You don't understand," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've given everything to this. I don't know what else there is." The weight of his words echoed in the room. He had invested everything in his empire, his wealth, his success, and his control over every detail. But at what cost? "You don't have to do this alone," Ember said softly. "You have me. You don't have to shoulder this alone. Let me help you." Brock turned back to her sharply, his eyes hardening. "Help me? How?" His voice was louder now, tinged with frustration. "What could you possibly do to fix this? To fix me?" Ember stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm not trying to fix you, Brock. I'm here to remind you that you are more than just this moment. You've been so focused on controlling everything that you've missed the most important thing of all. You're not defined by your failures or your successes. You're defined by your choices. And right now, you're choosing to hold on to control." Brock's eyes flickered with something, uncertainty, perhaps regret, but it was fleeting. The panic was still there, consuming him. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted quietly, the weight of the words making the air between them thick with tension. "I don't know how to trust again. I've been burned too many times. How do I let go and not lose everything?" Ember's voice softened as she took another step toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder, a quiet act of reassurance. By trusting yourself first, by knowing that it's okay to let go, you won't lose everything. You'll gain something much more valuable in return. For the first time, Brock didn't pull away. He let her hand rest there, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt less like a chasm and more like a shared understanding. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with the quiet weight of truth. "I'm scared," Brock admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of losing it all." Ember's heart ached for him. She knew what it felt like to hold on to something so tightly that it began to suffocate you. Control was never the answer, and Brock needed to learn that. "You don't have to lose everything," she said gently. "But if you keep holding on, you might lose the most important part of all. You'll lose yourself." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ember let her words hang in the air, waiting for him to process, to make a decision. This wasn't just about fixing a business deal. This was about Brock learning to trust, to let go, to embrace vulnerability in a way he never had before. The evening that followed was unlike any of the days before. Brock was more withdrawn than usual, though his face showed a new layer of vulnerability, one that hadn't been there when Ember first arrived at the villa. He wasn't just retreating into himself, he was wrestling with something far deeper. He had been broken open, whether he realized it or not. Ember knew that he wasn't just dealing with a business crisis. She could see that the real battle was internal. It was the fight between what he had built for himself and what he knew, deep down, he had to dismantle to heal. Control had been his shield for so long, and now it was becoming his prison. She couldn't leave him to face this alone, but at the same time, she didn't want to push him too hard. The boundaries were delicate. Brock wasn't ready to fully let go, and she understood that. But the one thing she had to offer him, trust, was something he needed to hear. The next morning, Ember didn't go to the guest room where they usually met. Instead, she went straight to Brock's office, where she found him alone, staring out the window once more. The vulnerability was still there, but it was mixed with uncertainty. He looked like a man who had been forced to look at the truth, even if he didn't know what to do with it. "Brock," she called softly. He didn't turn, but his hand rested on the back of the chair, as though he were unsure of whether to sit or stand. His gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, as though searching for something that wasn't there. She knew he wasn't just looking at the view, he was searching for an answer. "I'm not going to pretend like I know what you're feeling," Ember said, her voice gentle but resolute. "But I do know that what you're doing right now, pushing everyone away, hiding behind control, it's not working. It hasn't worked for a long time." Brock's shoulders tensed. He didn't want to hear it, she could tell. But she wasn't going to back down this time. She was done letting him hide behind his power. "It's the only thing that works," he replied, his voice tight, betraying his frustration. "If I don't control everything, I lose it. I lose everything. I lose myself." "And that's the problem, Brock," Ember said, her voice firm now, but not unkind. "You've been so focused on control that you've already lost yourself. You've built this empire around you, but it's been a mask. It's been keeping you from truly living. You're not a machine. You're a person. And it's time you started living like one." Brock turned to face her, his expression dark, but there was something more in his eyes now, something that wasn't there before. The fear. It was raw, and it was real. The fear of losing control, the fear of trusting, the fear of feeling too much. "You don't understand," he said, shaking his head, his voice full of despair. "If I let go, I'll lose everything. My reputation, my business, this house. Everything I've worked for." Ember stepped closer, her heart heavy with compassion. She knew how deeply the fear of failure cut. She had been there. The difference was that she had learned to embrace vulnerability. She wasn't perfect, but she had learned to trust that letting go wasn't the same as losing it all. "Brock," she said softly, "you've already lost everything. You've lost your ability to trust. You've lost the ability to feel. And yes, you might lose a part of your life when you let go, but you'll gain something much more valuable in return." Brock stared at her, his eyes searching her face. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The tension was palpable, thick in the air between them. Ember wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she could see his internal struggle written all over his face. He was so used to holding everything together, to being the man who could solve every problem, every crisis, that the idea of releasing even a little bit of control terrified him. "You've already started to change," Ember continued, her voice a little softer now. "You don't even realize it, but you're already letting go. The fact that you're standing here and talking to me instead of pushing me away, that's change. And it's good. It's a start, but it's going to take time. I'm not sure I'm strong enough for this," Brock said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. Ember reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the fabric of his shirt. She wasn't trying to fix him. She just wanted him to understand that he wasn't alone. "You don't have to be strong enough to do it all at once," she said softly. "You just need to start. And you don't have to do it alone. You've got me." Brock looked down at her hand on his arm. There was hesitation in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Hope. "I've spent so much of my life afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid that if I let go, it would all fall apart. That if I trusted someone, if I trusted myself, everything I built would be destroyed." Ember nodded, understanding that fear all too well. "But what if you're missing the point?" she said gently. "What if letting go doesn't mean losing everything? What if it means getting back what you've lost? Your happiness, your connection, your freedom?" Brock's gaze flickered toward her hand on his arm and then back to her face. The uncertainty was still there, but so was something else. A glimmer of possibility. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I don't know if I can do it." Ember gave him a soft, reassuring smile. "You're already doing it." For the first time, Brock didn't pull away. He stood there, frozen, as if he was unsure what to do next. Ember's heart was in her throat, and she knew this moment, this choice, was one he would remember for a long time. Change wasn't instant. It wasn't easy. But it could be done. And it had to start with letting go. Brock finally took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping a little. "I'll try," he said quietly, the words feeling like a weight lifted from him. "I'll try to trust again." Ember smiled, her heart swelling with hope. That's all anyone can do. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them comfortable for once. Brock's walls were still there, but they had begun to crack. Ember could see it in the way his gaze softened, in the way his body relaxed just a little bit more. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning. The days following the conversation about trust and letting go felt like a turning point. Brock's demeanor had changed, subtly but enough to make Ember take notice. It wasn't just that he had softened his tone when speaking to her, or that he had allowed others in the villa to handle tasks without micromanaging. There was something deeper, something more personal, beneath the surface. Brock wasn't just being more open with his employees, he was beginning to be more open with himself. The shift was so gradual, so quiet, that it almost seemed imperceptible, but Ember could sense it. He was still the same Brock, but with each passing day, the weight he carried seemed to lessen, if only by a fraction. They spent the next few days working closely together, finalizing the designs for the hotel. The process was smoother now, not just because of the designs themselves, but because of the way Brock approached their collaboration. He wasn't as distant anymore. He listened to her ideas. He respected her opinion, even when it contradicted his own. At the end of each day, there was a moment of stillness between them, a quiet, unspoken understanding that the project was only part of what was happening in their relationship. Ember knew that Brock's real journey wasn't about completing the hotel or signing off on the designs. It was about learning to trust, first himself and then those around him. On the fourth evening after their conversation, Brock invited Ember to join him for a late dinner on the villa's terrace. It was a tradition he'd started when they'd first begun working together. The view from the terrace was breathtaking, with the valley sprawling out below them, the lights of the city far in the distance. Tonight, the air was warm with the remnants of summer, and the stars above twinkled brightly, the perfect backdrop to what was becoming an important moment. Ember sat across from him at the long, polished table. It was just the two of them. No business discussions, no formalities. The silence felt comfortable, like they had finally found a rhythm together that didn't need words. Brock looked at her, his expression softer than it had ever been. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quieter than usual. Ember smiled gently, resting her hands on the table. "What part?" "About letting go," Brock said, pausing. "About trusting." There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Ember had only glimpsed in moments before. He wasn't trying to hide it now. He was allowing her to see it, to feel it. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of everything," Brock continued, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his wine glass. "But I'm starting to realize that I don't have to. Letting go doesn't mean losing everything. It means making room for something else." Ember felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to him. Brock was finally beginning to accept what she had tried to help him understand, that trust didn't equal weakness, that vulnerability didn't have to lead to disaster. It was a choice, not a surrender. "I think you're right," Brock said after a pause, his voice thoughtful. "I've spent so much time focusing on keeping everything together that I didn't realize what I was losing in the process. I've lost parts of myself, and I don't know if I can get them back, but I'm willing to try." Ember nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "That's all anyone can do, Brock. Trying is the hardest part, but it's also the most important. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to start." Brock looked at her then, his gaze steady, but with a deeper understanding in his eyes. The walls that had once kept them apart, both emotionally and physically, were beginning to crumble. There was no grand gesture, no explosive confession, just quiet change, a shift that was happening beneath the surface. "I think I'm starting to understand," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I don't know how to let go yet, but I'm not as afraid of it as I was before." That was the breakthrough Ember had been hoping for. Brock was acknowledging his fear, but he was also acknowledging that it no longer had to control him. He was willing to take the first step toward healing, and that, Ember knew, was the most important part of all. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling in the space between them. The villa, which had once felt like an emotional fortress, now felt like a place of transformation, a place where both of them were starting to realize the value of what they could build together. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," Ember said quietly, breaking the silence. "I'm here, every step of the way." Brock looked at her, his eyes softer now, and for the first time there was trust in his gaze. Something more than just gratitude, but a quiet recognition that he didn't have to face the world alone. "I know," he said, his voice sincere, "and for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to do everything alone." Ember smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. There was still a long way to go for both of them, but this was a new beginning. Brock was ready to face the emotional challenges that had haunted him for so long, and for the first time, he was willing to trust someone else with the burden. The next few days unfolded like a delicate dance, a slow, careful progression towards something that neither Brock nor Ember could fully define yet, but both were aware of its growing presence. Brock, who had once been fiercely guarded, began to make small but significant changes. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't completely free of his old habits, but he was trying. And that was something. Ember continued to witness his transformation, and while the changes were gradual, they were real. He was allowing others to contribute more freely, listening without the usual defensiveness that came with his need to control. At first, Ember had expected his vulnerability to be fragile, something that could easily slip away. But it wasn't fragile. It was just buried deep within him, hidden by years of emotional self-protection. And now, as it started to surface, it was stronger than she had anticipated. One evening, after a particularly long workday, Brock invited Ember to dinner again, though this time it felt different. There was no agenda, no business at hand, just the two of them sitting together in the dimly lit dining room, a peaceful silence stretching between them. The villa had always felt cold to Ember, but tonight, with Brock's presence more open and welcoming, it felt more like home. "I've been thinking about everything," Brock began, breaking the silence as they sipped their wine. His voice was quieter, but his eyes were more present. "I've spent so much time avoiding my emotions, avoiding the things that really matter, but I can't keep running from it. I can't keep pretending I have everything under control, because clearly I don't." Ember looked at him, her gaze steady. He wasn't just talking about the project or the villa. He was talking about his life, his past, the walls he'd built to protect himself from the world. And in that moment, she realized how much it had taken for him to admit that. "I think you're learning," she said softly, her voice calm. "The hardest part is acknowledging that it's okay to let go. Control was your defense mechanism, but it doesn't have to be your future. You can create something new." Brock's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't the arrogant smile he often wore, but a genuine one. There was a quiet sincerity in it that Ember hadn't seen before. "I've spent my entire life thinking I could control everything. The business, my emotions, even my relationships. I never realized how much it had cost me until now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a revelation. "And it's not just about the project anymore, Ember. It's about me, about my ability to trust again." Ember's heart swelled as she heard his words. This was progress. The Brock standing before her now wasn't the same man she had first met. He was vulnerable, yes, but in a way that was genuine, and that made him stronger, not weaker. "It's okay to be afraid," she said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "But you don't have to do it alone. You can trust again. And you don't have to do everything perfectly to be worthy of love or happiness. You're already enough." Brock's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the distance between them felt almost non-existent. The walls that had kept them apart were falling, and something else was growing in its place, a quiet trust that had been missing before. It was a trust not built on perfection, but on vulnerability, on the willingness to be seen. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I want to be more than the person I've been. I want to be the person you believe I can be." Ember smiled gently, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where Brock chose to let go of the need for control and step into a life that was less about perfection and more about connection. "I'm proud of you, Brock," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "I know it's hard, but I'm here, every step of the way." They sat there for a while, the words between them fading into a comfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from uncertainty or discomfort. It was a peaceful, shared understanding, a recognition that despite everything they had been through, they had both made progress. The journey wasn't over, but they were on the right path. Brock finally broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Ember, for not giving up on me. I know I've been difficult to deal with." Ember shook her head, her heart full. "You're worth it, Brock. We're worth it." And in that moment, everything felt like it had shifted. Brock wasn't the same man he had been when she first walked into the villa, and neither was she. Together, they were both learning to trust, to let go, and to build something real, not perfect, but meaningful. The days following their conversation on the terrace were filled with subtle but profound shifts in their relationship. Brock had started to truly understand that letting go didn't mean losing everything. It meant embracing the possibility of something better, something more meaningful, not just for him, but for everyone in his life, including Ember. For the first time in a long while, Brock's decisions weren't dictated by fear. He no longer demanded perfection. He was open to mistakes, to learning, and to trusting others. It was slow, this process of transformation, but it was real, and, perhaps most surprisingly, it was beginning to affect those around him. The employees at the villa, once wary of his temper and strict control, now found a different side of him, a side that listened, a side that trusted. Ember couldn't help but feel proud, but she knew this was just the beginning. The emotional road ahead for Brock would still be rocky. He had spent years building emotional walls, and even though he had started tearing them down, it would take time for him to feel truly free. One afternoon, after a morning of reviewing designs together, Brock invited Ember to sit with him on the terrace again. The soft breeze swept through the air, carrying with it the scent of jasmine from the garden. The view, as always, was breathtaking, but today it felt more peaceful, more grounded. Brock had been different lately. He was still the ambitious man who had built an empire, but he was starting to understand that his true value wasn't measured by his wealth, his control, or his accomplishments. It was about his ability to connect, to trust, to love. "Ember, I've been thinking about everything you've said," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You were right about something important. I've been living my life as if everything was in my control. But it's clear now that it's not about perfection or control. It's about the people you let in, and I've pushed everyone away." Ember met his gaze, her heart swelling with warmth. This was the man she had been waiting to see. The one who understood that life couldn't be lived in isolation. That connection wasn't a weakness but a strength. "You've come a long way, Brock," she said, her voice gentle but filled with pride. "But it's not just about the project or the villa anymore. You're starting to see that there's so much more to life than this need for perfection." Brock nodded, the weight of her words settling in. "I've lost so much because I didn't know how to trust anyone," he admitted, his voice low. "And I didn't know how to trust myself. But I'm starting to see that trust is everything. Without it, I was empty. Without it, everything I built doesn't matter." Ember smiled softly, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his words. Brock was no longer afraid of letting go. He had taken the first step in embracing the vulnerability that came with true connection. "I can see the difference in you," she said, leaning slightly closer. "You've made more progress in the past few weeks than I think you realize. And you're not alone in this. I'm here." The vulnerability in his eyes was undeniable now, and for the first time, Ember saw a man who was finally willing to live fully, to allow himself to feel without fear of losing everything. "I want to rebuild," Brock said quietly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Not just the hotel, but my life. I want to be someone who can be trusted, someone who doesn't run from his own emotions." Ember placed a hand over his, a soft gesture, but one filled with meaning. "You're already starting. You don't have to do it all at once. It's about taking it one day at a time. And trust me, you're on the right path." For the first time in a long while, Brock smiled genuinely, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that wasn't just for show. It was a real smile, and it was the most beautiful thing Ember had seen in him. The connection between them felt natural now, like two people who had walked through their own struggles and had come out on the other side, stronger and more connected than ever before. This was a new beginning, not just for Brock, but for them. Their relationship wasn't just about work or emotional support. It was about mutual growth and respect. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Brock said, his voice sincere. "I don't think I could have made it this far without you." Ember smiled, her heart full. "You're doing the hard work, Brock. I'm just here to remind you of what you're capable of." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the villa, Ember and Brock sat together, talking not about projects or designs, but about their lives, about their hopes, their fears, and their dreams for the future. And for the first time, Brock didn't feel like he had to control everything. He felt free, not because the world around him was perfect, but because he had learned to trust. Trust in himself and in those around him. The days after their heartfelt conversation on the terrace had a different feeling to them. There was a lightness in the air, both inside the villa and between Brock and Ember. While the villa's lavish spaces and perfect designs still exuded the wealth and status that had defined Brock's life for years, there was now something else. A quiet hope that had begun to take root. Ember could see it most clearly in Brock's actions. The once dominating presence he had maintained, always in control, always at the helm, was softened. He was no longer trying to dictate everything that happened in the villa. The perfectionism that had ruled his life had been replaced, little by little, with something far more meaningful: trust. And with that trust came vulnerability. Brock was allowing himself to feel the emotions he had so long repressed. His work had become less about maintaining control and more about creating something that mattered, something that would impact the lives of the people who experienced it, not just about how perfect everything looked on paper. Ember was careful to let Brock take the lead, knowing that change, especially of this magnitude, wasn't something that could be forced. She had been the guiding hand, but he had to be the one to accept it. She didn't rush him. Instead, she continued to offer him space, to challenge him when necessary, but also to listen when he opened up. One morning, Brock called her into the study, his voice unusually urgent. "Ember, I've been thinking," he began, his tone heavy with meaning. Ember glanced up from her sketches, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "What about?" she asked, setting her pen down on the table. "The project," Brock said, though it wasn't exactly what he meant. His words were cautious, as if he were testing the waters for something deeper. "I know we've been working on the designs for months, but I want to change direction," he continued. "I want the focus of the hotel to be less about the extravagance and more about the experience. I want people to feel welcome, not overwhelmed. And I want to make sure it reflects the values I've been learning, the ones I've been avoiding for so long." Ember stared at him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. Brock was no longer just speaking about aesthetics. This was about personal growth, a shift in mindset that had gone far beyond the walls of his business empire. He was speaking from a place of authenticity, not from the desire to impress others. "I think it's a great idea," Ember said softly, offering a small, knowing smile. "But what are you really trying to say here, Brock?" He paused, as if gathering his thoughts, before his eyes met hers. "I want to build a place where people feel like they belong, not a place where they feel inferior just by walking through the door. I've spent so long making sure everything was perfect, but I've realized that the people matter more. I want to create spaces where they can relax, where they can breathe, where they can let go." Ember's smile grew, her heart full. "You're starting to get it, Brock." He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the windows overlooking the estate. "I've been so afraid of losing everything that I didn't even see what I already had," he said quietly. "But now I see it. I see that the things that matter most aren't the things I can control. They're the things I've been too afraid to touch. Trust, connection, real love." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Brock was finally understanding that the most important things in life couldn't be controlled by money, success, or perfection. They were about being open and allowing himself to feel, to live fully, without fear of losing what he couldn't control. "I'm glad you see that," Ember said, her voice steady. "It's not easy, letting go of the need to control. But once you realize that you don't have to be perfect, that you can just be you, everything else will fall into place." Brock's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was something genuine in his expression. He wasn't just speaking the words, he had started to believe them. The breakthrough had been small, but it was significant. He was starting to trust himself and those around him. The fear was still there, but it wasn't as overpowering as it had been before. "You're right," Brock said quietly, his voice filled with reflection. "I don't have to be perfect. And I don't have to do this alone." Ember smiled, reaching out to touch his arm lightly. "I'm glad to hear you say that." Brock's gaze softened as he looked at her, and for a moment there was a quiet stillness between them, a connection that had deepened without either of them realizing it. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations of love. It was about understanding, support, and trust. Brock's eyes lingered on hers for a moment longer before he spoke again. "I'm starting to understand what you mean, Ember, about letting go, about trusting. I've been living my life with all these walls around me, thinking they were protecting me. But really, they were keeping me from everything that truly matters." Ember's heart swelled at his words. This was what she had been hoping for, not just his willingness to change, but his acceptance that change was necessary. The process wasn't over, but it had begun. And now, there was a future ahead of them both that was rooted in honesty, growth, and trust. "You're not alone anymore," Ember said softly, giving him a reassuring smile. "You have me, and we'll figure this out together." Brock looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that felt like hope. For the first time, He wasn't afraid to take the next step. He didn't have all the answers, but he was ready to trust again. It was a week after Brock's breakthrough that the past came knocking once again. The villa, which had become a place of emotional healing and growth, suddenly felt like a reminder of everything Brock had tried to escape. As he sat in the study late one afternoon, the phone call that came through shattered the quiet peace they had both come to cherish. "Mr. Caldwell," the voice on the other end said, "sharp and professional, the lawsuit is moving forward. The investors are threatening to pull out if you don't provide answers. They're demanding an immediate meeting." Brock's pulse quickened. The tightness in his chest returned, old habits and fears resurfacing like ghosts. The fear of losing everything. He ran a hand through his hair, looking out over the valley, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. It felt as though everything he had worked for was at risk of collapsing in on him. He had just begun to let go, to trust. But now, it felt as though the walls he had so carefully torn down were threatening to rebuild themselves in an instant. "Thank you," Brock said to the caller, his voice clipped. "I'll be there." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The pressure, the burden of his empire, had suddenly seemed too heavy to carry. He knew that the problem wasn't just the business or the deal, it was how he reacted to it. Brock closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The old reflexes, the desire to control everything, to shut everyone out, to fix everything on his own, came rushing back. He was beginning to feel the weight of his own choices, the fear of what would happen if he failed again. And then, as if by instinct, he thought of Ember. It had been her steady presence that had gotten him this far, her gentle but firm reminders that he didn't have to carry the weight alone. He couldn't shut her out, not now. She had become his anchor, the one person he could trust to help him weather the storm. He knew he had to talk to her, but a part of him still resisted. It felt like opening up would expose him once again to the same vulnerability he had been trying so hard to avoid. The fear of failure still loomed large, but he couldn't keep running from it forever. With a deep exhale, Brock left the study and found Ember in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench, looking out at the garden, her fingers absent-mindedly running over the edges of the leaves. The sight of her, peaceful and calm, brought a sense of grounding he hadn't realized he needed. He approached her slowly, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his with the same steady warmth she had always shown him. "Everything okay?" Ember asked, sensing the tension in his expression. Brock hesitated, then sat down beside her, rubbing his hands together as if trying to soothe the anxiety tightening his chest. "I just got a call. The investors are pushing for answers. They're threatening to pull out of the project if we don't move quickly, and I have to make a decision, a big one, within the next 24 hours. Ember's expression softened as she listened, but she didn't immediately speak. She gave him the space to process, to let the weight of his words settle in the silence between them. "What's going on inside your head?" she finally asked, her voice gentle but pointed. "What are you really afraid of?" Brock's eyes narrowed as he looked at the ground, his gaze flicking back and forth, restless. "I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid that all of this, all the work I've done, will fall apart." Ember placed a hand on his, steadying him with the simple touch. "You're afraid that losing control will make you lose everything. But losing control doesn't mean losing everything, Brock. It means releasing what you can't change. You have the power to choose how you respond, even when things feel out of your control." Brock met her eyes then, the words settling on him like a warm blanket. He realized she wasn't just talking about the business deal. She was talking about him, about how he had spent so much of his life trying to control every detail, afraid that losing control would bring disaster. And now, she was telling him it wasn't the loss of control that mattered. It was what he chose to do with the freedom that came from letting go. "I don't know how to let go of everything I've built," Brock admitted quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I've worked too hard, built too much to just walk away from it." Ember's voice was steady and reassuring. "You're not walking away from it, Brock. You're walking towards something different, something better, something that's not just based on what you can control, but on the people you can trust." Brock took in a deep breath, letting her words wash over him. She was right. The only way forward was to stop clinging to the past, to stop letting fear dictate every move he made. But the idea of taking that step, of embracing vulnerability fully, still felt terrifying. Ember squeezed his hand gently, grounding him in the present moment. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be true to yourself. Her words sank in, and for the first time, Brock felt the truth of them stir something deep within him. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be real. And for that to happen, he needed to trust. He looked at Ember then, really seeing her for the first time. She had been his guide, his anchor, but she had also shown him that he could stand on his own, that he didn't have to carry everything alone. I want to trust, Brock said quietly, his voice hoarse. But it's hard. I've been so afraid of what letting go would mean. Ember smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride for him. It's okay to be afraid, Brock. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to trust that you're not alone in this. I'm here. In that moment, Brock realized that letting go wasn't about losing control. It was about embracing the possibility of something new. And Ember had been right all along. The most important thing he could do was trust himself and trust her. For the first time, the weight he had carried for so long felt just a little bit lighter. The following days were filled with quiet transformation, not the kind that happened overnight, but the kind that felt like a ripple in the calm waters of Brock's life. For the first time, the villa, which had always felt like a symbol of his need for control, began to feel like a place of healing, not just for the hotel project, but for him. For both of them, Brock had begun to trust more, not just in Ember, but in himself. Every morning, when he woke up to the sprawling view of the city, the weight of the past few months didn't feel so heavy. The decisions he made weren't dictated by fear anymore. He had learned to step back and allow others to contribute, and for the first time, he felt that the weight of everything didn't have to rest entirely on his shoulders. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when old habits resurfaced. The temptation to control, to fix things on his own, would return. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always seamless. Change wasn't a light switch. It was a gradual, sometimes difficult process. One afternoon, as they reviewed the final stages of the hotel's designs, Ember noticed that Brock seemed distant, his usual energy replaced by a quiet tension. She hadn't expected the shift, but it was clear that something had unsettled him. This wasn't the Brock she had seen recently, the man who was trying. He was back to his old ways, distracted, withdrawn, the walls creeping back into place. The fear was rising again, threatening to swallow the progress he had made. Brock, she called softly, watching him trace a finger along the edge of the blueprint, his expression tight. Is everything okay? Brock didn't respond right away. His mind was clearly elsewhere, caught up in the details of the project, but there was something else behind his eyes, the familiar shadow of doubt. The same doubt that had haunted him for years, the doubt that said he wasn't enough, that if he let go of control, he'd lose everything he'd built. Ember sat down beside him, her voice steady but warm. You've been quiet today. Is something bothering you? Brock looked up at her, his face drawn with a mixture of frustration and fear. He didn't know how to articulate what he was feeling, the anxiety that was eating away at him, the sense that everything he was building was fragile, that all the progress he had made, letting go of control, was now on the verge of slipping away. I feel like I'm losing it all again, he said, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. I've started trusting, but now it feels like everything is falling apart. The investors, the project, my past mistakes. It's like I'm on the edge of something, and I don't know how to stop myself from falling. Ember reached out and placed a hand gently on his arm. The weight of his words settled into the space between them. She could feel the panic rising in him, the tightness in his chest, the familiar fear of failure. Brock, she said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. This feeling, it's normal. The fear comes, even when you're trying your best. But you're not the same person who started this journey. You're not the man who hid behind control. Brock met her eyes, and for the first time in a while, he didn't look away. The walls had started to come down, but the fear was still there. It was deep-seated, and it wasn't something he could escape overnight. "I'm afraid of losing everything again," he admitted, the raw vulnerability in his voice making Ember's heart ache. "I've spent my life protecting myself from pain, but the pain never goes away. It just keeps building. I don't know how to let go and still keep everything intact." Ember's grip on his arm tightened slightly, grounding him in the moment. She understood his fear. She had felt it herself when she had held onto her own walls for too long. But now, she knew better. She knew that letting go wasn't about losing control. It was about trusting that the world wouldn't fall apart if he allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Letting go doesn't mean losing control," Ember said quietly. "It means allowing yourself to trust. You don't have to fix everything on your own, Brock. You don't have to carry the world alone. You have to trust that you're strong enough to handle whatever comes. And you have to trust that people, me, will be here to support you." Brock looked at her, the weight of his fear still pressing down on him. But Ember's words were starting to sink in. She wasn't telling him to throw everything away. She was telling him to trust in himself and to trust in others. The weight wasn't his to carry alone anymore. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this," Brock whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if I can let go completely." Ember gave him a soft smile, one full of understanding and compassion. "You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to take one step at a time. And I'll be here with you, every step of the way." For the first time in days, Brock let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't completely free of his fear, but Ember's reassurance was like a lifeline, something real he could hold on to while he navigated this new, unfamiliar territory. "I'm trying, Ember," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm trying to trust, and I know it's going to take time. But I want to get there. I want to move forward, even if it's one small step at a time." Ember's heart swelled with pride for him. "You're already doing it. Every time you choose to trust, even a little bit, you're moving forward." The silence between them was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with possibility. The fear still lingered, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. They had crossed a threshold, and even though the path ahead was uncertain, they were no longer walking it alone. Brock looked at Ember, his eyes softening. For the first time, he truly believed that he could trust again. In her, in himself, in the process. The weight of his past mistakes and fears was still there, but he knew that letting go wasn't about erasing those mistakes. It was about making peace with them. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "Thank you, Ember, for being here, for helping me see that I don't have to do this alone." Ember smiled, her heart full of quiet satisfaction. Brock wasn't perfect, but that was okay. They weren't perfect. But together, they were beginning to create something real, something that went beyond control and perfection. They were creating trust, and that was all that really mattered. It had been weeks since Brock's breakthrough, and the change in him was nothing short of remarkable. No longer was he the emotionally distant billionaire consumed by his own fears. He had become a man who trusted, not just in his ability to rebuild his empire, but in those around him, and, most importantly, in himself. The walls he had built to protect himself had come down, brick by brick, and he was now standing in a new world, a world where vulnerability was strength and connection was more valuable than control. The villa, once a symbol of his power and emotional isolation, now felt different. It no longer held the same coldness. There was life in it now, a warmth that had always been absent. The hotel project, too, was progressing at a pace Brock hadn't expected, but he was no longer driving it with the intensity of someone afraid of losing everything. He was building it with intention, with an understanding of what mattered, people, and the connections that made life worthwhile. Ember was still by his side, of course. She had been his guide, his anchor, but now they were partners, not just in the project, but in the shared emotional journey they were navigating. Their bond had deepened, evolving from professional respect to something far more profound: mutual trust, understanding, and love. One evening, as the final stages of the hotel's design took shape, Brock found himself looking out over the villa's grounds again. The same city lights twinkled below them, but now, instead of feeling like a distant reminder of the life he had once lived, They felt like the beginning of something new. The future was no longer something to fear, but something to look forward to. Ember joined him on the terrace, her presence a constant source of warmth in his life. He turned to her, his expression softening as their eyes met. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said quietly. Ember smiled, her heart swelling at the sincerity in his voice. "We have. But you've come farther than you think. You've changed, Brock. Not just the hotel, you've changed. And that's what matters most." Brock nodded, a quiet sense of pride filling him. "I never thought I'd get here," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I thought control was everything. But it's not. Love is. Trust is. And you taught me that." Ember felt a lump form in her throat. For so long, Brock had been trapped in his own armor, refusing to let anyone in. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, not just as a successful businessman, but as a whole person, willing to trust and to love. "Brock," she said, her voice tender, "you didn't need fixing. You just needed the space to grow. And you've done that. You've learned how to trust, how to let go, and how to love again." Brock reached for her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers. The touch was simple, but full of meaning. He wasn't just holding her hand, he was holding onto the promise of the future they would build together. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. "I couldn't have faced all of this without you." Ember smiled, her heart full of warmth and affection. "You've always had it in you, Brock. You just needed to believe in yourself." The weight of their shared journey settled around them, and in that moment, the world outside the villa seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, a man who had learned to let go of his need for control, and the woman who had shown him what it meant to truly live, to trust and to love without fear. "Do you think we've really changed?" Brock asked, his voice filled with curiosity and a hint of doubt. Ember looked at him, a soft smile curving her lips. "I think the question is, have you? Because I see a man who has faced his fears, who has learned to trust himself, and who has learned to love. And that's change. That's what real strength looks like." Brock gazed at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. And for the first time, he understood. Ember was right. The change wasn't just about him overcoming his fears or building something successful. It was about learning to trust, to love, and to be vulnerable. "I don't know what the future holds," Brock said, his voice steady. "But I know I want to face it with you, not as a businessman, not as someone afraid of losing everything, but as the person I've finally allowed myself to be." Ember's heart swelled with affection for him. She knew that this was the moment, the one where they could both move forward together. No more fear, no more isolation, just trust, love, and the shared understanding that they were both capable of building something real. "You don't have to have all the answers," she said softly, her fingers tightening around his. "We're in this together. And that's all we need to know." Brock smiled, his heart full for the first time in a long while. The villa, the project, the empire, none of it mattered as much as this moment, this connection, this understanding that he had finally found peace. He had let go of his need for control, and in doing so, he had gained everything that really mattered. "I love you, Ember," he said, his voice low but sincere. Ember's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the words, it was the meaning behind them. She had never seen Brock more open, more vulnerable, and more alive than he was right now. "I love you too," she whispered back, a smile spreading across her face. "We've got this. Together." The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, now felt full of possibility. They weren't just building a hotel or a business. They were building a life, one based on trust, love, and the understanding that they didn't need perfection to be happy. They needed each other, and that was enough. The days following their conversation on the terrace felt different, lighter. Brock and Ember had begun to fully understand the depth of their connection, not just emotionally but spiritually. Brock was no longer the same man he had been when Ember first arrived at the villa. He had changed, not because he had been forced to, but because he had chosen to let go of his need for control and to embrace the possibility of real connection. Brock now allowed himself the freedom to be vulnerable, not just in front of Ember, but also in his work, in his life. He no longer kept the world at arm's length, protecting himself from the pain of living and loving. He was living in the moment, no longer controlled by his past, but embracing a future full of uncertainty and possibility. The transformation wasn't complete, of course. No change ever is, but the foundation had been laid, and both of them could feel it. They had crossed the line from fear to trust, from control to connection. They were no longer walking the path alone, but together. And that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat in the garden, the villa's lights twinkling softly in the background, Ember and Brock reflected on how far they had come. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" Ember asked, her voice thoughtful as she watched the sunset. Brock glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Every day." Ember raised an eyebrow. "What's going through your mind?" Brock paused, as if carefully considering his words. "When you first arrived, I was so determined to keep everything together, to make sure everything was perfect. I thought that if I controlled every detail, I could prevent disaster. I never imagined I'd end up here, letting go of all of that. But I don't regret it. Not for a second." Ember smiled, her heart swelling with pride for him. "You've come a long way, Brock." "I have," he admitted. "But I think I've only just started. I'm not perfect. Hell, I'm still learning. But now, I know I don't have to do it all alone. I don't have to control everything. I just have to trust." The vulnerability in his words made Ember's heart skip a beat. She had seen Brock's emotional walls break down in pieces, but hearing him say this out loud, with such conviction, was a testament to how much he had grown. "Trust is hard," she said softly, "but it's worth it. And I'm proud of you for letting go of what's been holding you back." Brock turned to face her, his expression sincere. "And I'm grateful for you, Ember. I wouldn't be where I am now without you. You've taught me that life isn't about perfection. It's about connection. It's about trust." Ember's heart fluttered at his words. Brock was no longer the man who feared vulnerability. He was someone who embraced the messy, imperfect parts of life. The fear had lessened, and in its place was something more precious, real connection, and the understanding that he didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. As the evening wore on, Brock reached for her hand, pulling her gently closer. The air between them was thick with emotion, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. "I'm ready for the next chapter," Brock said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "With you, in my life. Whatever comes next, I want to face it together." Ember's heart swelled at his words. She had known this journey wasn't just about Brock overcoming his need for control. It was about them. They had grown together, their connection deeper than anything she had expected. She had seen his vulnerabilities, his fears, and had chosen to stay by his side. She wasn't walking this journey alone either. "I'm ready too," Ember replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. Together. For a long moment, the world outside the villa seemed to fade into the background. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something new, something real. Brock leaned in, his hand still holding hers. His gaze softened, and for the first time, the walls that had once kept him distant were gone. He was finally here, fully present, not as a businessman or a perfect image of control, but as the man who had learned to trust and love. "I love you, Ember," Brock said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've changed my life." Ember smiled softly, feeling the warmth of his words wash over her. "I love you too, Brock, and I'm so proud of the man you've become, the real you." And as the night unfolded around them, Brock and Ember stood together, no longer burdened by control, no longer afraid to trust, no longer afraid to love. They had broken free of the walls that had kept them from truly living, and now they were standing at the start of a new journey, a journey filled with possibility, with trust, and with love. The future was still uncertain, and they would face challenges along the way. But for the first time, neither of them was afraid of the unknown. Together, they were ready for whatever came next. 1 year later, the villa stood as a testament not just to Brock's success, but to his transformation. The hotel project, once a symbol of his need for control, had been completed, and it had exceeded every expectation. But it wasn't the design or the luxury that made it special. It was the way it made people feel. Warm, inviting, and alive. A place where people could connect, where they could leave their burdens behind and embrace the moment. The villa, too, had become a home, not just a place of opulence and isolation. It was filled with laughter now, the sound of Brock and Ember enjoying each other's company, planning their future together. The once cold and calculating businessman had become the man who cherished the small, meaningful moments in life. The control that once defined him had been replaced with trust, vulnerability, and love. Brock stood on the terrace, watching the sunset over the city, a peaceful expression on his face. The view, once a constant reminder of the world he had built to shield himself, now felt like a reflection of the life he had earned, a life filled with connection, not isolation. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and without needing to look, he knew it was Ember. She had become his partner in every sense of the word, not just in business, but in life. Their relationship had deepened beyond anything he could have imagined, and now, as he stood beside her, he felt a deep sense of peace. "This view never gets old," he said quietly, his voice filled with contentment. Ember smiled, leaning into him. "It's beautiful. But I think the best part of it is that we're here, together." Brock turned to face her, his heart full. "I couldn't have gotten here without you, without your belief in me." Ember smiled softly. "You had to believe in yourself first, Brock, but I'm glad I could be here to support you." He looked down at her, his eyes softening. "I'm glad you're here too. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe." Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining as they stood together, looking out over the valley. The connection between them felt effortless now, built on trust, understanding, and love. "You've changed my life too, you know," Ember said, her voice warm. "You've taught me that letting go of control doesn't mean losing everything. It means opening yourself to something better." Brock smiled, his gaze meeting hers. "And I've learned that it's okay to be vulnerable, to trust, to love." Ember's heart swelled at his words. Brock had learned what so many people never did, that true strength wasn't about perfection or control. It was about trust, in yourself, in others, and in the process of living without the need for constant certainty. "You've come so far," Ember said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Brock chuckled softly, squeezing her hand. "We've both come a long way." They stood there for a long moment, taking in the view. It wasn't just the scenery that had changed, it was their lives, their hearts. Brock was no longer the man he had been when Ember first walked into the villa. He had become someone more real, someone who had learned to embrace the imperfection of life. And Ember, the woman who had guided him, who had never given up on him, had become his equal, his partner. "Do you ever think about the past?" Brock asked, after a long silence. Ember thought for a moment before replying, "I think about it, but not in the way I used to. The past is a part of who we are, but it doesn't define us anymore. We've both changed, and we're still changing." Brock nodded. "I don't think I'll ever stop changing, but I know that with you by my side, I can face whatever comes." Ember smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I'll always be here. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The night was falling slowly, and the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them. The villa, once a symbol of emotional distance, had become a place where Brock and Ember had found not just love, but peace, and the understanding that life was about more than just control. It was about trust, connection, and the willingness to let go when the time was right. Brock pulled her closer, his heart full, knowing that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face them side by side. Together. Brock's journey wasn't easy, and neither is life. Sometimes we hold on to control so tightly that we forget the true strength lies in vulnerability and trust. What has been the hardest thing for you to let go of in your own life? How have you learned to embrace trust over perfection? Share your thoughts below, and let's continue the conversation here on Romance Stories with Mr. Daniel.